Gunny sack craft industries used looms which produced the cloth bags utilized in the compression process of olives in olive mills, as well as feed bags and long and narrow carpets called runners. The yarn used was made from goat wool by women with the aid of a spinning wheel. They would place the goat wool in a piece of cloth around their waist and wrap the ends of 2 threads to the pulleys of the spinning wheel. At the same time, they tied 2 ropes around their waist, which began at the wooden spinning wheel and were attached to a small grommet. Then the women would walk backwards. This set in motion the spinning wheel, as well as the pulleys. The pulleys pulled the yarn, which was tucked in the piece of cloth the women had around their waists. Meanwhile, the women would hold the other end of the yarn with their fingers, drafting the wool being unfolded by the pulleys and turning it into yarn. When they reached a sufficient distance, depending on the space of the area where they worked, they tied the fully prepared yarn and started the process again. The looms used in gunny sack craft industries were set in an upright position and required a lot of muscular strength, which is why men were also employed as workers. First, they would put the warp threads around the upper and lower horizontal beams at the 2 ends of the loom, and tie them to an iron rod attached to the lower beam. The distance between the lower and upper beam was adjusted according to the length of the piece of cloth to be woven. The total width of the warp threads defined the width of the cloth. The threads were tied to the rod with a plow knot, the same knot used for tying plow belts, which created the crossing of the threads. Then the weavers would push this crossing to the upper part of the loom, using a long, thin piece of wood called a shed rod. A long, thick cylindrical stick called a batten was used for increasing the opening at the crossing, called a shed. Then they tied all the pairs of yarn to a rope known as a cord, which was parallel to the heddle. This way the heddle would hold the crossing. This process was called shedding. To begin weaving, workers inserted the long shed rod under the heddle and rotated it in order to open the shed. Through this, the weavers then passed a wooden stick called a shuttle, on which they tied the weft thread. The weft thread was passed through the inside and outside of the shed and was tied horizontally to the vertical warp threads stretched between the upper and lower beam. Finally, they would batten the weft thread with the reed by moving the long batten up and down and by pushing the warp thread by hand according to the crossing in order to complete the weaving process. This way, the horizontal weft threads were interwoven with the vertical warp threads attached to the upper and lower beam until they created the woven cloth.